The day Esther Wainwright rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she had $17 sewn into the lining of her boot, a loaded derringer tucked against her ribs, and a story ready on her tongue that was not a single word true. That was how she had always operated. A smile here, a well-placed lie there, a calculated reading of the room before she ever opened her mouth. She had learned early that a woman alone in the West of 1882 did not survive by being honest. She survived by being smarter than the man across the table, quicker with her words than he was with his hands, and never, ever letting him see the fear that lived permanently behind her eyes like a candle flame she kept cupped from the wind. She pulled her gray mare, Juniper, to a stop in front of the Caldwell Grand Hotel, which was neither grand nor particularly hotel-like, being a two-story wooden structure with a sagging porch and a hand-painted sign that had lost the letter D somewhere between painting and hanging. The town itself was a railhead town, sitting fat and loud on the Kishom Trail, which meant it was full of cowboys who had just finished a long drive north and were looking for somewhere to spend their wages and their restlessness. Esther had been to towns like this before. She knew the type. She swung down from Juniper with the practiced ease of a woman who had been riding since before she could properly tie her own shoes, and she surveyed the street with the quiet, measuring gaze that had become second nature to her over 29 years of living. The saloons were already loud, even in the early afternoon. A group of drovers stood outside the mercantile arguing over something that involved a lot of pointing. A woman in a calico dress was hanging washing on a line strung between two posts, and she gave Esther the kind of look that said she had taken her measure already and found her interesting enough to watch. Esther did not mind being watched. She was used to it. She was not unattractive, and she carried herself with a stillness that tended to draw the eye. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, pulled back at the nape of her neck in a practical knot that had never once in its life been called fashionable. Her eyes were the pale, clear gray of river water in winter, and they missed very little. She wore a plain riding skirt, a white shirtwaist that had seen better days, and a jacket that had once belonged to a man 3 sizes larger than her, which she had taken in herself with neat, economical stitches. She had come to Caldwell because she needed work, and because a woman named Dorothea Haas, who ran a boarding house in Wichita and who had taken a liking to Esther the previous winter, had written to say that a man named Aldous Pryor was looking for a bookkeeper at his mercantile, and that he was decent and not the kind to cause trouble. Esther had read that letter 3 times and then written back asking for the specifics, and Dorothea had confirmed them. Aldous Pryor, 62, married 30 years, father of 4, respectable member of the Caldwell Town Council. It sounded like the safest harbor she had seen in quite some time. She tied Juniper to the rail, unstrapped her saddlebag, and went inside to arrange lodging. The hotel was run by a woman named Mrs. Clements, who was somewhere north of 50, and had the look of someone who had decided long ago that the world was exactly as disappointing as she had always suspected, and had simply adjusted her expectations accordingly. She gave Esther a room on the 2nd floor for $2 a week, pointed out where the washroom was, and mentioned without being asked that the dining room served supper at 6 and that she did not tolerate noise after 9. Esther thanked her, took the key, and went upstairs. The room was small and clean, which was more than she had expected. A single window looked out over the main street. The bed had a quilt on it in a log cabin pattern, worked in blues and creams, that was so unexpectedly beautiful that Esther stood looking at it for a moment before she set her bag down. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe. This was the part she never showed anyone. The quiet few minutes after she had gotten through whatever she needed to get through, when the performance could come down and she could just exist without calculating anything. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and let the tension run out of her shoulders, and she looked at that quilt and thought about the woman who had made it, stitch by patient stitch, and wondered if she had been happy while she worked. Esther had not been happy in a very long time. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was functional, which was a different and lesser thing, and she had made her peace with it. Happiness required a kind of openness that she had quietly closed off years ago, after her husband Thomas Wainwright had died of a fever 3 days after their first wedding anniversary, leaving her with a small farm outside of Abilene, a pile of debts she had not known existed, and the devastating realization that everything she had believed was solid and safe was, in fact, built on sand. She had sold the farm, paid what she could of the debts, and started moving. That had been 6 years ago. In those 6 years she had kept books for a livestock dealer in Abilene, taught school for 8 months in a sod house settlement outside of Dodge, managed the accounts for a hotel in Wichita, and done approximately 100 smaller jobs in between. She had talked her way out of 3 dangerous situations, negotiated her way into 4 good ones, and learned to read people the way a river reads the land, always finding the path of least resistance. She had survived. That was what she did. She was very, very good at it. She did not know yet, sitting on that blue and cream quilt in a sagging hotel in Caldwell, Kansas, in the late spring of 1882, that she was about to meet someone who would make her remember a version of herself she had packed away and nearly forgotten entirely. She did not know that survival, while impressive, was not the same as living. She unpacked her bag, changed into a cleaner shirtwaist, pinned her hair back into something resembling order, and went to find Aldous Pryor's Mercantile. She found it on the 2nd block north of the hotel, a solid establishment with 2 glass-fronted display cases that she could see through the window, and a sign above the door that read Pryor and Son General Merchandise in red and gold letters. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful jangle, and she stepped in to find the store busy with the kind of afternoon trade that told her the place was genuinely well run. Aldous Pryor himself emerged from the back at the sound of the bell, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a broad man, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had clearly been handsome in his youth and had settled into something better than that with age. His eyes were brown and attentive, and he looked at Esther with an expression that was pleasantly businesslike without being unwelcoming. She introduced herself, gave him Dorothea Haas's letter of introduction, and stood quietly while he read it. She did not fidget. She never fidgeted. He looked up and studied her for a moment. "Miss Haas speaks very well of you. She is a generous woman," Esther said. "But the references I have attached are from employers, not friends. They are more reliable." He looked at the additional letters she had brought, took his time with them, and then looked up again with something in his expression that she recognized as decision being made. "Can you start Monday?" "I can start tomorrow," she said. He smiled at that, and she knew she had him, not through artifice, through competence, which was the cleanest kind of persuasion there was. She started the next morning at 7 o'clock, sitting at the small desk in the back room of Pryor and Son General Merchandise with the accounts ledger open in front of her, and within 2 hours she had found 3 errors that had been compounding for the better part of a year. She brought them to Aldous Pryor's attention without drama and without any implication that he was at fault, and she outlined how she would correct them going forward. He looked at the figures for a long time. "My previous bookkeeper was not this thorough. Your previous bookkeeper may not have understood debentry methods," she said simply. "No," he agreed. He did not. He paused. "You are hired permanently, Miss Wainwright, if you want the position." She said she did, and so her life in Caldwell began. She settled into it with the methodical efficiency she brought to everything. She learned the town's rhythms, the names of the regular customers, the prices at competing establishments, the names of the council members and the marshal and the school teacher and the minister. She was pleasant to everyone and intimate with no one, which was exactly how she preferred it. She ate supper at the hotel dining room, read in her room in the evenings, attended church on Sundays because it was the sort of thing that built goodwill without costing much, and saved money with a discipline that bordered on religious. She had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks when she first saw Walter Merritt. It was a Thursday, which was typically a slow morning at the store, and she had been in the back with the ledger when she heard voices out front and then heard Aldous Pryor say, with a warmth she had not previously heard in his voice, "Walt, you are a sight. When did you get back?" She came out to find a man standing at the counter who was not quite what she had expected from Aldous Pryor's tone. He was not particularly tall, though he was taller than average, built broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else in the way of a man who worked physically and ate what was put in front of him without ceremony. He wore trail clothes, a little dusty from the road, with the kind of easy wear that said he had been wearing similar clothes for years and had stopped noticing them. His hat was a well-made thing, dark brown, pushed back on his head with the casual confidence of a man who was not trying to look like anything in particular. He was 32 or 33, she estimated, dark blonde hair that had been lightened further by the sun, a face that was open and direct in a way that she found immediately suspicious, because in her experience faces that looked that honest were almost never that honest. His eyes, when he turned and saw her, were a clear, steady brown, the color of good earth. He looked at her without any of the usual reactions she had learned to categorize. Not the appraising look that said he was deciding whether she was worth pursuing. Not the dismissive look that said a woman in a business context was a novelty at best. Not the studied disinterest that said he had something to hide. He just looked at her straightforwardly, the way you might look at something new in a room you had been in many times before, noting it with genuine curiosity. "Walt," Aldous said, "this is Esther Wainwright. She is my new bookkeeper, and she has been doing the work of 3 men since she arrived. Esther, this is Walter Merritt. He runs the Merritt cattle operation east of town. He has been on the trail since March." "Miss Wainwright," Walter said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Merritt," she said, with the pleasant professional nod she gave to customers. And that was that. He had business with Aldous, something about a hardware order he had placed before the drive, and she returned to the back room and her ledger, and she thought very little more about Walter Merritt for the rest of that day. But then she thought about him a little the next day, which was unusual. It was the directness of his eyes that stayed with her. She was not used to being looked at without an agenda behind the looking. He came into the store twice more that week, which she could hear but not see from the back room, and on the second occasion she was standing at the counter when he arrived, and they exchanged a few words about whether the shipment of wire fencing that had been delayed from Wichita had yet arrived. It had not. He expressed mild but uncomplaining frustration about this, said he would check again next week, thanked her, and left. That was the whole of it. And yet she found herself thinking about the way he had said thank you, which had been completely genuine and entirely without any of the complicated layers that most men put into simple words. She told herself she was being ridiculous and went back to the ledger. What began to dismantle her careful system of avoidance was not attraction, exactly. It was proximity and repetition, and the small, slow accumulation of detail. Walter Merritt came into Pryor's store regularly, because the Merritt cattle operation was one of Aldous Pryor's most reliable accounts, and because Walter, unlike many ranchers, handled his own supply ordering rather than delegating it. He was in the store perhaps twice a week through June, and because Esther was the one who managed the orders and accounts, she found herself dealing with him directly more often than not. He was easy to talk to. That was the dangerous thing about him. She had expected to have to manage him the way she managed most men, keeping the conversation controlled, staying slightly formal, offering just enough warmth to be pleasant without anything that could be misread. But Walter Merritt did not seem to require managing. He talked to her the way he talked to Aldous, with a directness and a lack of pretense that she found, after a while, deeply disorienting, because she did not know how to be disarmed without feeling exposed. She learned things about him in the way you learn things about a landscape through repeated travel. He had grown up on the ranch east of town, which his father had built from nothing in the late 1860s after coming west from Ohio. His father had died 4 years ago, and he had taken over the operation entirely. He had a younger sister named Clara who lived in Topeka, married with 2 children. He read, which surprised her, and he read widely, which surprised her more. He had opinions about things, formed clearly and held without aggression, and he was willing to revise them when presented with better information, which was rarer than it should have been in any human being, but was particularly rare in her experience of men. He was kind. She kept bumping up against this fact like a stone in a familiar road. He was patient with the town's more difficult customers when he encountered them at the counter. He helped Mrs. Clements carry a heavy parcel to her wagon without being asked, and without making anything of it afterward. He knew the names of the Pawnee farmhands who occasionally came into town to trade, and he used them correctly, which in the Kansas of 1882 was not nothing. The Indian peoples of the region had been pushed and pressured and displaced with a ruthlessness that made Esther's stomach clench when she thought about it too directly. And the fact that Walter Merritt knew the names of Pawnee men and used them with respect was the kind of small signal that told her something real about who he was. One afternoon in late June, she was still at her desk in the back room when Aldous had already gone home, and she was finishing a set of accounts that she wanted to have ready by morning. She was so deep in the work that she did not hear the front door until Walter Merritt was already calling out, "Aldous, anybody home?" She came to the doorway. "The store is officially closed, Mr. Merritt, but if you need something quickly I can help you." He looked surprised to find her there. "I am sorry to keep you late. I only needed to drop off the order amendment I mentioned on Tuesday. I can leave it on the counter." "Bring it here," she said, because she was going to have to deal with it anyway. "I will note it in the order ledger now so it does not get lost." He came around the counter, which was the first time he had been in the back room, and he looked around at her desk, at the neat stacks of ledgers and the organized rows of files, with an expression she could not immediately read. "This is extraordinary," he said. "Aldous told me you had organized things back here, but this is," he searched for the word. "Efficient," she offered. "I was going to say beautiful," he said simply. She looked up at him. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the ledger system, and his expression was entirely sincere. He meant the organization was beautiful. She understood that perfectly. And yet something in her chest moved strangely, like a door that had been latched for a long time shifting in its frame. She took the order amendment, noted it carefully, and told him she would have the revised order out by Friday. He thanked her and he left, and she stood in the back room for a moment after the bell above the door had rung his exit, pressing her fingertips to the desk's surface and breathing quietly. She had survived on Cleverness for 6 years. She knew how this worked. She knew how to keep her head, keep her distance, stay in the part of herself that was capable and measured and untouched by things that could not be relied upon. She knew how to do that. She gathered her things, locked up, and walked back to the hotel in the warm June evening, and she thought about the word beautiful said in a voice that had no angle in it whatsoever, and she thought, quite deliberately, about something else. The trouble arrived in early July in the form of a man named Cass Dunmore. Cass Dunmore was a cattle buyer who came through Caldwell every summer when the trail drives ended, and the selling season was at its height. He was 45, heavyset, with the kind of easy charm that announced itself loudly and meant nothing at all. He was, Esther recognized immediately, the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted through a combination of money and persistence, and who had long since decided that the first word from another person was merely the opening position in a negotiation he fully intended to win. He came into Pryor's on the 2nd day of July, placed a large order, and flattered Esther with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. She received it with the pleasant blankness she had perfected for exactly this type, and he seemed, for the moment, to accept her professional tone as a temporary obstacle rather than a genuine answer. He came back the next day, and the day after that, each time finding a reason to linger near the counter when she was there, each time escalating the conversation slightly from the merely professional. She managed him with the patience and precision of a chess player, neither encouraging nor provoking, never giving him anything he could use while never being openly rude. She was too experienced at this game to let him draw her off her own ground. But on the fourth day, he said something that was not business, and it was not flattery, and it was not negotiation. He leaned on the counter and looked at her with a smile that was much less pleasant than his usual and said, "I have been asking around about you, Miss Wainwright. A widow woman, traveling alone, 6 years on the road. A woman like that learns to be practical about her situation." She held his gaze very steadily. "A woman like that," she said, "also learns to recognize when a conversation has ended." She returned to her ledger without another word. He was not pleasant when he left, but he went, and she sat at her desk in the back room afterward and was quite still for a while, making sure the anger in her chest burned down to something more manageable before she trusted herself to continue working. She did not tell Aldous Pryor about it. She did not tell anyone. She had handled worse than Cass Dunmore a dozen times, and she would handle this. That was what she did. But Dunmore came back the following week, and this time he brought the particular brand of pressure that involved other people. He mentioned, in front of 2 other customers, that he had heard she had left a situation in Wichita under some unclear circumstances, which was a lie invented to see if she would panic. And she did not panic. She said, calmly and clearly, that she had left Wichita because a better position had become available, and if he had specific questions about her references, he could speak with Aldous Pryor, who had them on file. It worked, and he retreated again, but she could feel the shape of where this was going, and she spent the next few nights lying on the blue and cream quilt staring at the ceiling, and thinking it through with the same careful, methodical analysis she applied to everything. Dunmore was not going to do anything that crossed a line that could be named, because men like him rarely did. What he would do was continue to apply pressure in ways that were deniable, continuing to build an atmosphere around her that made her position uncomfortable, continuing to imply to people she needed to trust her that she was not trustworthy. It was a slow erosion, and it was effective, and she had seen it work before. She ran through her options. She could take it to Marshal Tilghman, but what would she tell him? That a man had been mildly unpleasant. There was nothing actionable in what Dunmore had done. She could ask Aldous Pryor to exclude him from the store, but that would cost Pryor a significant account, and she would not do that to a man who had treated her fairly. She could leave, which was always an option and had always been an option, and which she was so tired of being an option. She was good at surviving. She was very good at it. What she had never quite figured out was how to do more than that. She was thinking this in the back room on a Friday afternoon when she heard the bell above the door and then Walter Merritt's voice. And then, a moment later and in a different register entirely, Cass Dunmore's voice saying something she could not quite hear. She came to the doorway. Both men were at the counter. Aldous was not in the store, having stepped out 20 minutes ago to help his wife with something at the house next door. Dunmore was saying something to Walter in the convivial tone he used when he was establishing a witness to something, the tone that said he was performing ease. Walter was listening with an expression that was politely blank in the way of a man who had not yet decided what he was looking at. Dunmore looked over and saw Esther. His smile widened. "Miss Wainwright, I was just telling Mr. Merritt here about the time I came across a woman answering your description in Abilene, working in circumstances that were not quite so respectable as this. But perhaps I have the wrong woman." There it was. The flat-out lie with 2 men as audience and no graceful exit except a denial that would sound like protest. She held herself still and felt the familiar cold machinery of her mind begin to work through responses, calculating which version of this she could come out of with the least damage, which denial would land most cleanly, what she needed his face to do, and what she needed Walter Merritt's face to do, because she needed Walter Merritt to believe her, and she had not known until this moment how much she needed that. And then Walter Merritt said, in a tone she had never heard from him before, quiet and very precise, "I think you have the wrong woman." Dunmore turned to look at him. "I think," Walter continued, without raising his voice at all, "that you are telling a story about someone who does not exist, and I think you know that. I also think this is the last time you are going to walk into this store and say something like that, because the next time you do, I am going to walk over to Marshal Tilghman's office and explain to him that a cattle buyer who comes through Caldwell every summer has been working a harassment campaign against a woman who has done nothing to earn it, and I will have a list of specific dates and incidents that I will ask him to consider. This town keeps records, and so does that woman." He nodded toward Esther without breaking eye contact with Dunmore. "And she has been keeping better records than you have." Dunmore was quiet for a moment. His smile had gone, and what was underneath it was not pleasant, but what was also underneath it was a man who was making calculations of his own, and arriving at the conclusion that the ground here was less favorable than he had thought. He picked up his hat from the counter, put it on with a deliberate slowness that was the last remnant of his dignity in the situation, and he walked to the door and he left without another word. The bell above the door rang his exit. Esther stood in the doorway of the back room and said nothing for a moment, because she was doing something she rarely did, which was feeling the full impact of what had just happened without immediately moving to analyze it. Walter turned to face her. He did not look particularly triumphant about what he had just done. He looked slightly concerned, the way someone looks when they think they may have overstepped. "I apologize," he said. "If you would have preferred to handle that yourself, I should have let you. But I saw what he was doing, and he stopped. I am sorry if that was not what you wanted." "It was exactly what I wanted," she said before she had made the decision to say it, which was unusual enough that she felt it physically, a loosening somewhere in the region of her breastbone. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression settled. "Good," he said. "I meant it, by the way, about the records. If he comes back, you have a basis for a formal complaint, and I will testify to what I heard today." "I know you meant it," she said. And then, because 6 years of habit was 6 years of habit, she said, "Thank you," in the tone she used with customers, the pleasant professional tone, and she returned to the back room. She sat at her desk and did not open the ledger for a full 4 minutes, which was unprecedented. Cass Dunmore did not come back to Pryor's store again. In the weeks that followed, something changed in the space between Esther Wainwright and Walter Merritt, and she was aware of the change with a precision that she found uncomfortable because she was not sure what to do about it. He still came to the store twice a week on average. He still talked to her in the same direct, uncomplicated way. But now there was an additional quality to it, a kind of attention that was not intrusive, but that she could feel the way you can feel sunlight through a window, even when you are not facing it. He asked her questions, real questions that expected real answers, about the work she had done before Caldwell, about the places she had been, about things she had read. He told her things about himself, about the ranch, about problems he was working through, and she realized after a while that he was not telling her these things to impress her, but because he was genuinely interested in how she thought about things. Nobody had been interested in how she thought about things in a very long time. She began to enjoy the conversations. She caught herself looking up from the ledger when she heard the bell above the door, which she noted with a small, sharp internal alarm. She began to notice things about him that she had no practical reason to notice, the way he listened fully, without the partial attention most people gave, the way he laughed, which was sudden and genuine and not performed for anyone's benefit. She told herself, quite sternly, that she was a sensible woman who was not going to mistake convenience and proximity for something it was not. But then one Thursday in late July, there was a summer storm that came in fast and hard off the plains, the kind that announces itself with a smell of iron in the air, and then arrives before you have properly prepared. Esther had been to the post office and was halfway back to the store when the sky went green-yellow, and the wind kicked up with the violence it reserves for Kansas summers. She ran, but the rain hit before she reached the store door, and she arrived at the door of Pryor's completely soaked, dripping on the threshold, her carefully pinned hair entirely undone and streaming down her back, her ledger tucked under her coat which she had not had time to button. Walter was inside, standing at the counter, in the middle of saying something to Aldous that he stopped saying when she came through the door looking like something the creek had brought in. She stood there dripping and was aware, for one extremely unusual moment, that she was not composed. She had lost her composure completely to the simple physical fact of rain, and she was standing in front of a man she had been carefully composed around for 6 weeks, and she was wet from head to foot, and her hair was everywhere. She heard Aldous make a sympathetic sound and say something about getting a towel from the back, and she heard her own voice say something politely normal about the storm, and she was performing automatic social function while looking at Walter Merritt's face, which was doing something she was not quite sure how to read. He was not laughing, though there was something in his eyes that was adjacent to warmth and to what might have been delight if it had been allowed to go all the way. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no file for, and then he said quietly, "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said, which was the automatic answer. "Your ledger is dry," he said, glancing at the book she had tucked under her coat. "You protected the ledger." "Well," she said, and felt something move in her chest that was very close to the thing she had been working not to feel. "Someone has to." He smiled at that, and it was a smile she had not seen from him before, softer than his usual, and it landed somewhere inside her defenses before she had time to register it. Aldous came back with a towel, and she wrung out her hair and composed herself, and the moment passed, and she filed it away in the category of things that did not bear too much examination. But that evening in her room, sitting on the bed with her hair drying around her shoulders and the sound of the diminishing rain on the window, she let herself examine it a little. She was not 17. She was not naive. She understood that loneliness was a persuasive architect, and that it could build things from very thin materials that looked solid until you leaned on them. She had leaned on things that were not solid before, and she had learned from it, and she was not going to build something out of a man's smile, and the fact that he had stood up for her, and the way he listened with his whole attention when she spoke. She was not going to do that. And then August came, and it undid several of her best resolutions. It started with a conversation about books. She had mentioned in passing that she had recently finished a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that she had borrowed from the Caldwell Lending Library, which was a single bookcase in the back of the newspaper office, and Walter had looked at her with an expression of genuine pleasure and said, "I have read that. What did you think of Dorothea?" "I thought she was brilliant and underused," Esther said, before the professional filter could catch it, "and that the book is a tragedy disguised as a domestic story." Walter looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it is. Everyone I have said that to has disagreed with me. Everyone I have said that to has told me women do not typically read books of that length," she said. "Everyone I have said that to," he said, "was wrong." She laughed. It was an unplanned laugh, the kind she had not had in some time, and it surprised both of them slightly, and they stood in the back room of Pryor's Mercantile in the full heat of a Kansas August afternoon and talked about George Eliot for 45 minutes while the accounts waited. After he left, Aldous Pryor came into the back room with a look on his face that she chose not to acknowledge, and she opened the ledger and said, without looking up, "The wire fencing order still has not arrived." "I know," Aldous said pleasantly. "It will arrive." She decided she was going to let herself have the conversations. That was all. She was going to have the conversations, and she was not going to make anything more of them than what they were, and she was going to be a sensible woman about it. She had been sensible for 6 years, and it had kept her alive and solvent, and she was going to keep being sensible. But the thing about Walter Merritt was that he did not push. He did not escalate. He did not treat her conversations as a path towards something he was trying to reach. He was simply present in them, genuinely, without an agenda, and this was the most disarming thing she had ever encountered because she had no defense against it. Her entire system of self-protection was built on reading men's agendas and staying ahead of them, and a man who had no agenda was a thing she had no strategy for. She thought about this one evening when she was writing a letter to Dorothea Haas in Wichita. She wrote about the job, about Caldwell, about the summer heat, and then she stopped with the pen hovering and thought about what to write next. And what came to mind was Walter Merritt saying the word beautiful about an organized ledger system, and she put the pen down and looked at the wall. She had survived on cleverness alone for so long. That was the truth of her life, and she had been proud of it, quietly, in the private way of a woman who has no one to be proud in front of but herself. She had been clever enough to find work and keep it, clever enough to manage difficult men and navigate hostile situations, clever enough to build a life that was stable and safe even in a place and time where stability and safety were not given to women. They were things you had to construct by hand and maintain constantly. But she had been so focused on the cleverness, on the reading of rooms and the managing of situations, and the maintaining of the careful distance that kept her safe, that she had stopped doing something else. She had stopped being willing to step into anything that was not already mapped. She had stopped doing the thing that required not knowing how it would turn out. She was beginning to understand, forgotten how to be brave. She picked up the pen and finished the letter without writing about Walter Merritt at all. On a Sunday in mid-August, after the morning church service, she was walking back toward the hotel when she heard her name and turned to find Walter coming down the church steps behind her, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had been thinking about something and had decided to say it. "Would you be willing to take a walk?" he asked. "There is something I would like to show you. It is nothing dramatic, just, I think you would find it interesting." She looked at him for a moment. Every sensible instinct she had said to decline politely and go back to the hotel and the ledger she had been planning to catch up on. "All right," she said. He took her to the river. The Chicaskia ran a couple of miles east of town, and they rode Juniper and his horse, a dark bay gelding named Prospect, out in the Sunday afternoon light that turned everything golden and slow. He did not talk much on the ride, which she appreciated, because she was doing her own version of settling into the situation. At the river, he showed her a bend where the bank curved under a stand of cottonwoods that were so old and large, their roots went into the water, and their canopy made a complete ceiling of moving silver-green light. She had not known this was here. She had passed through this county a dozen times, and she had not known this was here. She stood under the cottonwoods and looked at the light moving on the water and felt something loosen in her that she had not known was tight. "I come here sometimes," he said, standing a little behind her and to the side, "when things need thinking through." "It is very beautiful," she said. A pause. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at the water for a long time. He was quiet beside her, the good kind of quiet, the kind that is not waiting for anything, just accompanying. She said, because the place and the light and the loosening made her less careful than she intended, "I have been in 40 towns in 6 years. I have never shown anyone anything like this because there was never time to find anything like this." He did not say anything immediately, which was the right response. "I always meant to stop," she said, "at some point. I always told myself I was just waiting for the right situation." "And now?" he asked gently. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those steady brown eyes, and there was no pressure in his face, nothing that was trying to make her answer anything she was not ready to answer. There was only the genuinely patient interest of a person who wanted to know the answer if she wanted to give it. She said, "I think I have been confusing the right situation with the safe situation, and I think they may not be the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, I do not think they are." They rode back to town in the evening light, and she felt the strange, uncomfortable sensation of something in her that had been locked for years moving toward unlocked. She was not ready to call it by its name yet, but she was aware of it. In September, Esther's settled life in Caldwell was interrupted by news from Wichita that arrived in the form of a letter from Dorothea Haas. The letter informed her that the livestock dealer she had worked for in Abilene before coming to Caldwell, a man named George Calloway, had apparently been telling people in several Kansas towns that he had dismissed her from his employ for dishonesty. This was a lie. She had left George Calloway's employ voluntarily, with a month's notice, after he had attempted to underpay her for work she had documented carefully, and she had copies of every account she had handled for him, and they were clean. But a lie like that, spreading through the network of merchants and employers in the region, could be genuinely damaging. She sat with Dorothea's letter and felt the old familiar cold settle into her stomach, the cold that said, "Here it is again, the thing you cannot quite outrun, the vulnerability of being a woman alone whose reputation is her only collateral." She thought about it carefully all that day and into the evening. She had the documentation. She had the ledger copies. She could write letters. She could contact the people who had employed her after Calloway. She could build a paper case against his claim. This was what she knew how to do. What she had never done, because it required a kind of directness that felt too exposed, was simply confront the source. She knew George Calloway. She knew him well enough to know that he was not a brave man, and that the lie he was telling was probably less malicious than it was a defensive maneuver. Something he had said once in a moment of wounded pride after she had left with the documentation that proved his underpayment, and which had cost him more than he liked. She knew that if someone who was not her confronted him about it, he would fold. She also knew that it was not her responsibility to find such a person, and she had never once asked someone else to fight this kind of fight for her. But she thought about Walter Merritt, standing at the counter in Pryor's store, saying, "I think you have the wrong woman," and she thought about how that had felt, and she made a decision that was different from the decisions she usually made. She went to Walter's ranch the next afternoon. She had never been there before. It was 3 miles east of town, set back from the road behind a line of fence posts that were newly painted white, and the house was larger than she had expected, built of stone and timber, solid and well-maintained, with a kitchen garden on the south side, and a barn behind that was clearly the real center of operations. There were several hands in the yard, and they watched her ride up with curiosity but no hostility. Walter was at the corral and came out to meet her before she had fully dismounted, and his expression when he saw her was surprised but pleased, which was a combination that she found, to her irritation, rather wonderful. She told him about George Calloway clearly and completely, not performing distress and not minimizing anything. She told him what the situation was, what she had in the way of documentation, what she believed Calloway would do if directly addressed, and what she was asking. "I would like you to write to him," she said. "Not a threatening letter, simply a letter from a Caldwell business owner asking him to confirm or retract. He will retract. But coming from me, it gives him the option to make it about what he claims I did. Coming from a third party with no stake in it, he has to address the fact directly." Walter was quiet for a moment. He had been looking at her throughout this with an expression she now recognized as him processing something fully rather than reacting to it. "Of course," he said. "I'm not asking you to fight for me," she said, because she needed to say this. "I have everything I need to fight this myself. I'm asking you to be a voice that makes it efficient to resolve quickly rather than stretching it out for months." "I know," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him. "Most people do not see that difference." "I see it," he said simply. "He wrote the letter that evening." She read it before it was sent, because she was not going to send anything with her situation in it without reading it first, and it was exactly right. It was measured and businesslike and left no room for evasion without being aggressive. It asked Calloway to confirm the accuracy of the statements attributed to him, and if those statements were inaccurate, to provide written retraction to 3 named individuals in Wichita and Abilene whom she had identified. George Calloway's written retraction arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks later. She held it in her hands in the back room of Pryor's store and felt something that was not her usual cold competence. It was something warmer and more complicated, and it had less to do with the retraction itself and more to do with the fact that she had asked for help. She had asked for help, specifically and clearly, without apology, and without losing a single piece of herself in the asking, and the person she had asked had helped her in exactly the way she had asked, and not in any way she had not. She had not known that was possible. She had been so busy being clever that she had forgotten brave was also a thing you could be. Clever calculated the safest route. Brave chose the right route whether it was safe or not. She had been calculating safety for so long that she had stopped distinguishing between the two. She went to Walter's ranch that afternoon to tell him the retraction had arrived and to thank him properly. He was in the kitchen garden when she arrived, inexplicably pulling up something that turned out to be a very stubborn parsnip, and he looked up at her approach with dirt on his hands and the same unreserved pleasure at seeing her that she had been filing away in the not-to-be-examined category for months. She told him about the retraction. He said he was glad. She said thank you properly, meaning it. And then she said, because she had decided to be brave, Walter, I would like to have dinner with you, not as a business matter, as something else. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds she watched his expression go through something that told her, clearly and without ambiguity, that she was not the only one who had been carefully not naming things. Yes, he said, I would like that very much. He cleaned the dirt from his hands on his trouser legs with the easy lack of self-consciousness of a man who did not perform dignity, and he smiled at her with a smile that she felt all the way to her heels. They had dinner at the hotel dining room that Friday evening, because it was the best restaurant Caldwell had, and Esther wore the dark green dress that she had bought in Wichita the previous winter and had been saving for a significant occasion, and she thought, getting dressed, that this qualified. He was waiting in the lobby when she came downstairs, dressed properly, hat in hand, and the look on his face when he saw her in the green dress was one she took down to dinner with her and held close for the entire evening. They talked for 3 hours over a meal that neither of them paid much attention to. They talked about Ohio, where his father had come from, and Kansas, where she had come from, and what it meant to build a life from materials that were not quite enough. They talked about loneliness, with the careful honesty of two people who had decided to be honest, and she found that he had been lonely too, that the years since his father's death had been years of work and efficiency and not much else, and that he had also, in his way, forgotten how to want something for himself rather than just maintaining what existed. I think, she said, toward the end of the evening, that I have been treating my own life like a ledger I was managing for someone else. He looked at her steadily. What would it look like if you managed it for yourself? She thought about the river bend with the cottonwoods and the moving silver-green light. She thought about the quilt in her room and the $31 she had accumulated in her boot lining and the 17 towns she could leave for tomorrow if she had to. She thought about what it would mean to not have to. Something like this, she said. I think it would look something like this. He walked her back to the hotel after dinner, and at the door he said goodnight in the way that said he was not going to push anything, which was exactly the right thing. And she said goodnight back and went upstairs and sat on the blue and cream quilt and did not try to stop herself smiling. They had Sunday dinner together the following week, and the week after that, and somewhere in the weeks that followed the dinners became a given rather than an arrangement, and the conversations expanded to include evenings on the porch of his ranch house watching the prairie go dark, and the time he came to help her move the heavy filing cabinet at the back of Pryor's store without being asked, having heard her mention it was needed. And the time she brought him a book she had found at the newspaper office library that she knew he would want to read, and he looked at the cover, and then at her with an expression that was not surprise so much as a kind of grateful recognition. She spent time at the ranch more frequently now. She liked the place, the solidity of the stone walls, the good clean smell of the barn, The way the land opened up in every direction with that particular Kansas immensity that she had always respected without quite knowing how to live inside. She watched Walter work, which he did with a quiet competence she found deeply appealing, and she helped when she could, and she began to understand the operation well enough to see how it could be run more efficiently. She mentioned this once, tentatively, expecting either dismissal or the particular condescension of a man who had been told he was doing something wrong by someone he had not asked. Walter listened to everything she said, asked 3 clarifying questions that told her he had understood it precisely, and then said, "You are completely right. I would like to work through the specifics with you if you are willing." They worked through the specifics over the next 2 weeks, and she reorganized his supply ordering system with the same methodical pleasure she brought to any ledger problem. And the result saved him time and money, and he was genuinely, specifically grateful in the way that felt real, because it was about the actual work rather than about her. She found in October that she was happy. She noticed this carefully, the way you notice a change in the weather when you have been watching for it. She was happy, not the performing function kind of contentment she had been calling happiness for 6 years. The real kind that had weight to it and showed up unexpectedly in small moments, the particular quality of the afternoon light on the ranch, or a book Walter had left at the store for her with a note in his direct, uncomplicated handwriting, or the way she woke up in the morning now not thinking about the next careful move, but simply glad the day was arriving. She wrote to Dorothea Haas in Wichita, and this time she wrote about Walter Merritt. She wrote 3 paragraphs and then read them back and was startled by how clearly they said something she had not quite admitted to herself yet. She admitted it to herself then. She was in love with him. She sat with this for a day, not because she doubted it, but because it was serious, and she was a serious person, and she wanted to understand what she was going to do about it before she did anything. What she was going to do, she decided, was nothing differently, because she had been honest with him since the night of that first dinner, and he had been honest with her, and they were already moving toward this, both of them, in the unhurried way of 2 people who had been careful for a long time and were learning to move differently. She was right. 3 weeks later, on a November Saturday when the first real cold of the year had come in and the sky was the pure pale blue of deep autumn, he took her to the river bend again, and they stood under the cottonwoods which had gone to gold, and he said, without preamble, the way he said everything, "Esther, I would like to ask you to marry me." She looked at him. "I know that might not be what you want," he said. "I know you have built something here that is yours, and that you have spent a long time making sure you were not dependent on any person or any situation for your stability, and I am not asking you to change that. I am not asking you to give up your work or your autonomy or any part of what you have made of yourself. I am asking if you would be willing to build something with me. That is all." She was quiet for a moment. The cottonwood leaves moved overhead. The river ran below. She had stood in this exact spot in August and understood that she had been confusing the safe route with the right route, and here was that understanding waiting to be acted upon. She said, "I need you to understand something first." He looked at her steadily. "I am not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions and I will express them, and I will not manage the household accounts without visibility into how decisions are made about money, and I will keep my work for as long as I want to keep it, and if something in our life together is not working, I will tell you directly rather than working around it." "Good," he said. "I would not want anything else." She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 6 years reading people, and she read him now with all the skill she had, reading below the surface to see if there was something else, some version of this offer that had a hidden underside. There was not. What she saw was exactly what was presented, a man who meant what he said, the whole of what he said. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He looked at her with the expression that was not surprise but was a very good thing adjacent to it, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his, and they stood in the gold cottonwood light beside the running river, and she felt something complete itself in her that had been in the process of completing for months. They were married in December, a practical affair at the minister's house with Aldous Pryor and his wife Margaret as witnesses, and Mrs. Clements from the hotel, who had become, in Esther's quiet way, something approaching a friend. Esther wore the dark green dress again, because she liked it and saw no reason to acquire a new dress for the occasion when this one was perfectly suitable, and had already proven itself at least once to good effect. She moved out to the ranch the week after the wedding, which meant leaving the hotel room and the blue and cream quilt, and she felt a small pang about that quilt that she mentioned to Walter, and 3 days later she came home from the store to find the quilt folded at the foot of their bed, because he had gone back and bought it from Mrs. Clements without comment, and she stood looking at it for a moment with a feeling in her chest that she recognized as the very particular warmth of being known. She kept her position at Pryor's store through the winter and into the following spring, riding in on Juniper 3 days a week, and Aldous expressed no surprise at this, and paid her the same rate he always had, which told her he had anticipated it. Walter had been right about him being a decent man. The ranch came alive for her through that winter in a way she had not expected. She had thought of it as Walter's place, the place she was coming to live, and what she found instead was a place that seemed to receive her with a kind of recognition. She took to the work of it with the same organized energy she brought to everything, and what had been well run became genuinely streamlined in ways that freed up time and reduced cost, and Walter watched this with a pleasure that was about her rather than about the efficiency, which she found she had no defense against. In the evenings they read together, a habit that developed without any particular ceremony, simply because it was what they both wanted to do, and they talked about what they were reading with a completeness of engagement she had not experienced with another person since the literary circle she had belonged to briefly in Wichita, which had disbanded when 3 of its members relocated. She had missed it more than she had allowed herself to register. In February, she told him she thought she was expecting a child. They were sitting by the fire when she told him, and he was quiet for a long moment that she did not try to fill, and then he looked at her with an expression she had no category for because she had not previously seen it, which was the face of a person whose life has just expanded in a direction they deeply wanted but had not quite believed was available. He said quietly, "Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling extremely well," she said. "I am, however, already planning the reorganization of the small bedroom." He laughed, and it was the sudden genuine laugh she loved, and he reached across and took her hand and held it, and they sat by the fire with the winter pressing on the stone walls and the warmth on the inside of it, and she thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, traveling with $17 in her boot and a story on her tongue, and she felt a tenderness toward that woman, for all the cleverness and all the survival, and she felt glad, profoundly and completely glad, that the story had not ended there. Their son was born in October of 1883, a healthy, loud, brown-haired boy whom they named James Aldous Merritt, the middle name given for Aldous Pryor, who was visibly moved when informed of this, and who arrived at the ranch 3 days after the birth with a generous parcel of goods from the store that was far more than was necessary, and exactly what was wanted. James was a vigorous and opinionated baby from his first day, which Esther found entirely appropriate and Walter found apparently delightful, and the house filled with the particular chaos of new parenthood, which she approached with the same methodical energy she brought to the accounts, and which Walter navigated with a patience that she had not doubted but was still glad to see confirmed. She continued at Pryor's store on a reduced schedule through the following year, 2 days a week when James was old enough to be left with Mary, the young woman she had hired to help at the ranch, and Aldous accommodated this with the practical goodwill that had characterized his dealing with her from the beginning. The work kept her sharp and kept her connected to the town in the way she had found she valued, and the money she earned went into the account she kept separately, not because she did not trust Walter, but because she had earned it herself, and it mattered to her that it was hers. And he understood this completely because she had told him so, and he was a man who listened. She thought sometimes, riding back to the ranch in the evenings with the Kansas sky going all colors above her, about the title she had given herself for 6 years. Survivor. It had been a proud title and a hard one, and she did not disclaim it. But she had come to understand that survival was the floor, not the ceiling. You survived, and then you built. You built from what the survival had given you, the clarity and the competence and the hard-earned understanding of what the world actually was, and you built something that was not just standing but thriving. She had been brave, she understood now. She had always been brave. Not in the way she had stopped recognizing. The quiet daily bravery of choosing to stay in something, to want something, to reach for something you could not be certain of keeping. She had packed that kind of bravery away in the early years of her widowhood, because it had hurt too much, because the thing she had wanted and reached for and kept had been taken from her in the space of 3 days and a fever, and the grief of that had been a silent, controlled, managed grief that she had never sat with long enough to fully feel. She sat with it now, sometimes, in the way you can sit with old grief when the present is solid enough to hold you. She had loved Thomas Wainwright, the young, hopeful love of 22 years old with everything still ahead, and he had died, and it had been devastating, and she had survived it by closing down the parts of herself that could be devastated and operating on the parts that could not. And she had been so busy surviving that she had forgotten she was also brave. Walter had reminded her. Not by telling her so, not by any grand speech, but by simply being a person she could be fully seen by, who asked real questions and waited for real answers, who stood at a counter and said, "I think you have the wrong woman," with a quiet certainty that was not performing courage but simply was it, and who had shown her a river bend with cottonwoods as if it were something worth sharing, and who had meant it about building something together, the whole of what that meant. In the summer of 1884, she came home from a Tuesday at the store to find Walter in the kitchen garden with 18-month-old James on his hip, pointing at the bean plants with an expression of parental instruction that James was receiving, with the concentrated attention of someone who had inherited a tendency to thoroughness. She stood at the gate and watched them for a moment without making herself known, feeling the particular fullness of a happiness that had substance to it, that was built on real materials and was not going anywhere. Walter looked up and saw her, and his face did the thing it always did, the uncomplicated pleasure of it, and he said, "James has opinions about the bean plants." "He has opinions about everything," she said. "He gets it from both of us." James looked at her with wide brown eyes, Walter's eyes, and said something emphatic that was not quite a word yet. And she came through the gate and took him from Walter's hip and held him against her shoulder, and he patted her face with a small, firm hand, and Walter stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, easy and warm, the way he did everything. The prairie stretched east in the late afternoon gold, the same prairie she had ridden across and across for 6 years going somewhere else, always somewhere else, and now she was here, and here was where she was. By the time winter came around again, they were expecting their second child, which made Esther look up from the ledger where she had been calculating household accounts and say, to no one in particular, since Walter was in the barn and James was asleep, that she was going to need more space in this filing system. She reorganized the filing system the following Tuesday, making space for the additional category, and found the process deeply satisfying, which was simply who she was and always had been. The second child arrived in August of 1885, a girl this time, pink and fierce, who announced her arrival with a volume that caused Mary to come running from the other side of the house. They named her Clara Jane Merritt, Clara for Walter's sister in Topeka, Jane for Esther's mother, who had died when Esther was 11, and who had been, from everything Esther could remember, a woman of formidable competence and quiet dignity whom she had been trying to honor ever since. Clara's arrival produced in James a 2-year-old's complicated reaction that cycled through fascination, outrage, and proprietary affection over the course of about 3 weeks, and then settled into something that was clearly going to be a permanent fierce-eyed protective loyalty, which Esther watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a pattern she recognized. Walter's sister did, in fact, make the trip from Topeka that autumn to meet her niece and nephew, and she was exactly what Walter had described, a warm and direct woman with 2 children of her own who was immediately, practically, completely at ease with Esther in the way that said she had been worried about what kind of woman her brother had married and was now reassured. They sat at the kitchen table the second evening of her visit and talked for 3 hours while Walter and Clara's husband, a man named David who handled livestock in Topeka, sat on the porch with the children, and Esther found in Clara Merritt the kind of conversation she had not expected to find and was grateful for. Clara said at one point, looking at Esther over her coffee cup with a directness that was very like her brother's, "He is different than he was before you, happier but not just that, more complete somehow." Esther thought about this. "I think," she said, "we were both slightly unfinished before. We have been finishing each other." Clara smiled at that, and it was Walter's smile, the sudden genuine one, and Esther felt the warmth of belonging to this family, which was a thing she had not expected to feel again, and which she received with the careful, full attention it deserved. The years that followed were the years of building, and they were good years, full and varied and not without difficulty, because that is the truth of any real life. There was the drought summer of 1887 that hit the whole of central Kansas hard, when the cattle operation ran at a loss for 8 months, and she and Walter sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers and reworked the financial structure of the operation with a calm determination that did not pretend the difficulty was not real, but did not allow despair to settle in either. They had the reserve she had built through careful management in the good years, and they got through the drought year intact, and came out the other side with a clearer understanding of the land and its rhythms that Walter incorporated permanently into how the operation was run. There was the winter of 1888 when James had a serious lung illness and was sick for 6 weeks, during which Esther did not sleep properly for most of that time, and experienced fear in a way that was deeper and more physical than any fear she had felt for herself. And Walter was beside her through all of it with a steadiness that she leaned into without apology, which was itself a thing she could not have done years before. James recovered fully, and she wrote to Dorothea Haas in Wichita about it afterward, and found that the letter she wrote was full of gratitude, not just for his recovery, but for the fact that she had not been alone in it. Aldous Pryor retired from the mercantile in 1889, handing the operation to his son Robert, who had been working alongside him for years. Esther continued in her bookkeeping role under Robert's ownership, the transition handled smoothly, because she had organized the accounts thoroughly enough that there were no surprises. On the day Aldous cleaned out his desk at the store, he shook her hand and said, "You are the best professional decision I have ever made, Esther Merritt." And she felt the weight of the years in that simple sentence, and thanked him sincerely, and watched him walk out of the store toward his comfortable retirement with the warmth of genuine respect. In 1890, James Merritt, age 7, developed a passion for horses that his father recognized and encouraged, and Esther taught him to read accounts at an age when most children were just learning to read basic text, because he had shown interest, and she was not the type to say wait until you are older. Walter watched these lessons with an expression of delighted quiet pride, and occasionally joined in, and was occasionally corrected by his 7-year-old on the details of a subtraction, which he accepted with the same undefended honesty he accepted everything. Clara Jane Merritt, at 5, showed every sign of being a child whose inner life was considerably more complex than her outer presentation suggested, which Esther recognized with a particular intimacy. She spent a great deal of time observing things carefully before she spoke, and when she did speak, it was usually directly to the heart of the matter, and she had inherited her mother's gray eyes and her father's steadiness, and was going to be a remarkable person. Esther told Walter this one evening on the porch, and he agreed, and they sat in comfortable silence with the prairie dark around them, and the house lit behind them, and the sounds of sleeping children, and they were content in the way that is not passive but active, the contentment of people who have built something they are glad to live inside. In the spring of 1891, they had their third child, a second son, named Henry Thomas Merritt, Thomas for Esther's first husband, which she had told Walter she wanted, and he had understood without needing explanation why it was important to her to carry that name forward, to honor the young hopeful love of 22 without pretending it had not been real. Henry was a placid and cheerful baby who seemed to find the enthusiasms of his older siblings primarily amusing, and who slept through the night from the second week, for which the entire household was profoundly grateful. The Caldwell that Esther had ridden into in the spring of 1882 with $17 in her boot, and a story ready on her tongue, had changed considerably in the intervening years. The cattle trade had shifted as the ranges opened, and the railheads extended further south and west, and Caldwell's particular moment as a key point on the Kisham Trail had begun to pass, as such moments always did. The town settled into a different kind of stability, less wild and loud and provisional, more permanent and various. New buildings went up. A proper school was built, with a dedicated teacher, and Esther was one of the people who had organized the school board that funded it, because she had been to enough places without adequate schools to know what it cost people. The school board work gave her something she had not anticipated, which was the experience of working directly on problems that affected the community she was part of, the community she had chosen when she had let herself be stopped from moving. She was good at it, for the same reason she was good at accounts. She could see the structure of things, where the resources were misaligned, and where they could be better distributed, and she said so clearly in board meetings that were sometimes contentious, and she was not intimidated by contention when the ground was sound. Walter attended the board meetings when he could, and on the occasions when someone was dismissive of a point she had made, he had developed, over the years, an economy of response that was more effective than any long argument. He would simply look at the person steadily and say, "I think Miss Wainwright's point deserves a fuller consideration," and then be quiet, and the particular quality of that silence was such that fuller consideration generally followed. She appreciated it immensely without needing it, which was the precise equilibrium they had arrived at together. There was a morning in the summer of 1892 when she was in the barn helping James, now 9 and fully competent with the horses, and he said to her without particular drama, in the way he said most things, "Did you always know you were going to live here?" She thought about this seriously, because he was a child who asked serious questions and deserved serious answers. "No," she said, "I did not know it until I was here." He nodded, absorbing this, and went back to brushing the horse. He had Walter's ease with information, the way of receiving something and letting it settle without having to immediately respond. She watched him for a moment and felt the layered gratitude that was by now one of the textures of her daily life. She went into the house and found Walter at the kitchen table with the account books he was reviewing for their annual summary, and she stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment, the same way she had stood at the garden gate 8 years ago and watched him with James and the bean plants, and he looked up and saw her, and his face did the same thing it had always done. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She came to the table and sat down across from him. "I am thinking," she said, "about the fact that I came to this town with $17 and a story that was entirely false, and I have ended up with more than I knew how to want." He looked at her steadily. "What was the false story?" she smiled. "That I had a brother in Caldwell who was expecting me. I told it to the hotel desk in case anyone thought a woman alone was a problem. Did you have a brother anywhere?" "No." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think the real story was better." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And through the open window came the sound of James in the barn and Clara calling something from the garden and the distant, patient sound of the prairie wind. And she held all of it all at once, without trying to manage any of it at all. That was the thing she had come to understand. The cleverness had been necessary. It had brought her through years and miles and dozens of difficult situations with herself intact, and she would never be ashamed of it. But it had always been a way of staying safe while the bravery waited in the back room with the lights off. The bravery was the thing that had walked out of that back room and said yes to a river walk in August, yes to asking for help with Calloway, yes to standing in the cottonwood light and saying this is the right route and not the safe route, yes to him, yes to here, yes to the life that was larger than the life she had been carefully maintaining. She had been brave. She had always been brave. She had just needed someone to stand at a counter and say, with quiet certainty, "I think you have the wrong woman," to remind her. 10 years later, Esther Merritt sat at the same desk in the back of what was now Pryor and Son Mercantile, though Robert Pryor had added a second room and a third ledger system since she had built the first, and she was finishing the quarterly accounts with the focused pleasure she still brought to the work. And through the front window, she could see the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1892, and it looked like home. It looked like home because she had let it be home, which was the brave thing, the braver thing by far than any of the 20 years of clever survival that had preceded it. Home required the courage to stop leaving, to put your roots down into uncertain ground and trust them to hold. Hers had held. The ground had been good. The man had been good. The life had been good, genuinely, specifically, fully good, and she had been present in it, not managing it from a careful distance but living inside it with the full weight of herself. James was 19 now, deeply involved in the cattle operation alongside his father, learning the land with the same serious thoroughness he had brought to the account books at 7. Clara was 17, studying in the mornings with the books Esther ordered from Wichita, determined to go to the women's college in Lawrence when she was old enough, a plan that both her parents supported completely. Henry, age 11, was the kind of child who befriended every living creature he encountered, and had currently adopted a 3-legged dog of unclear origin that followed him everywhere and slept under the kitchen table. Walter was 53. A little grayer, not much slower, still the most honest person she had ever been in a room with. They had had arguments and difficult years and the small daily frictions of any real partnership, and they had worked through all of it with the same directness and good faith that they had brought to each other from the beginning, because that was the foundation they had built on and it held. She finished the quarterly accounts, blotted the last entry, and set the pen down. She looked at the neat columns of figures, the clean evidence of a business well run, and she felt the familiar satisfaction of work done with care. Then she put on her jacket, said goodbye to young Thomas who had taken over the counter duties, untied Juniper from the rail, and rode home. The road east ran between fields that were showing the first green of the spring, the prairie grass coming back after winter the way it always did, unstoppable and persistent, and exactly the right color of hope. The sky was enormous and pale blue, the way it got in Kansas in early spring before the heat of summer came in to deepen it. She rode with the ease of a woman who had been riding this road for 10 years and knew every stone in it, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was a form of peace she had not known she was capable of for a very long time. The ranch came into view with its white-painted fence posts and its stone and timber house and its well-kept barn, and she could see Walter at the corral. and she could see Henry crossing the yard with the three-legged dog at his heels. And there was smoke from the kitchen chimney where Mary, who had been with them now for 8 years and was part of the household in every meaningful sense, was starting the evening meal. Walter saw her coming and lifted a hand. She lifted a hand back. She turned Juniper off the road and through the gate, and she came home, and it was everything, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and she was precisely and completely where she had chosen to be. By an act of bravery that had begun the day, she stopped calculating the safest route and started choosing the right one. The cottonwood trees along the river were budding again, the way they did every spring, the new leaves coming in silver pale before they deepened to their summer green. She would take Walter there this Sunday, she thought, the way they did sometimes, to sit beside the water in the moving light and say nothing in particular and be together. The things worth keeping, she had learned, were always the things you had been brave enough to reach for when there was no guarantee. She dismounted in the yard, and Walter came to take Juniper's reins from her, and he looked at her in the evening light with 10 years of marriage behind them and said, simply, "Good day." "Good day," she said. And she meant it absolutely.